So today I'm going to talk to you about the impact of the Papal Bull. We're going to talk about the positive impact that it had on Elizabeth and England, and therefore the little or negative impact that it had on the Pope. We're going to talk about the positive impact that it had for the Pope and the Catholic Church, and then I'm going to give you some historians' opinions about the Papal Bull itself. So to start, the document itself, written in February 1570, had quite a few technical errors. It named her as saying that she had made herself supreme head of the church when she hadn't. She had purposefully made herself supreme governor. It didn't give her the opportunity to defend herself, and it said that she should be deposed from the throne immediately rather than within 1 year of the excommunication, which had happened in every other example of a monarch being excommunicated. So these technical errors did weaken the impact of the Papal Bull on Catholics in England, in Catholics around the world, and it did make the Pope look very rash, and that he had come to this decision very quickly and without a huge amount of political thought. Coming to that kind of rash behaviour, he hasn't included Philip in this. Now, Philip of Spain was really the only person in a position to be able to put this Papal Bull into action. France was not in a position. They had their own issues with the Huguenots in France, and so were going to be unable to lead the attack based on the Papal Bull, and so would purposefully or by accident not including Philip, it did mean that the Pope lost essentially his kind of Catholic warrior in actually enacting this Papal Bull. The Pope himself, he had acted based on what he believed morally, rather than the fact that he thought it was a particularly good and well-timed act politically. People did question why, for 11-12 years of Elizabeth being on the throne, the Catholic Church stood by and watched, and now all of a sudden had said that she shouldn't be, she was not the legitimate queen, that she shouldn't have any kind of right to the throne. People did question why for the previous 12 years they had acknowledged her and they had communicated with her, if all this time the Catholic Church didn't actually believe that she was the rightful queen. Leading on to how it affected people in England, while the Papal Bull did alleviate men of their kind of allegiance and the choice that they had to make between either their queen or their religion, it meant that they no longer had to be having an allegiance to the queen or the monarch. Most men actually chose the state and their queen rather than their religion. And it is partly because of the technicalities, the flaws in the Papal Bull, that they were able to cite that as their reason why they were choosing their monarch over their religion. And actually, maybe if Pius had made sure that there was no flaws in the Papal Bull, that Catholics in England would have had very little excuse to choose their queen over their faith. The evidence for this is that from 1570 the number of English Catholics didn't actually increase very much at all, and you would expect it to if people now felt that they could choose their religion and leave their allegiance to their queen behind. And actually the evidence that we have saying that people were ready to revolt, that Catholics were ready and poised to stage an uprising, were mistakes by Rodolphe and Despes, who led Philip to believe that Catholics were ready at the drop of a hat to revolt against their queen. Now, the flaw in that information that we have is that it's not accurate information as such. The only national survey that was conducted to do with the number of Catholics refusing to go to church was in 1577. So in Christopher Haig's book, The Reign of Elizabeth, and it's a chapter that's not only edited by him, but it's actually written by him. He says that in 1571 there were a number of bishops who identified recusants to Elizabeth. For example, in Norwich and Winchester and in Hampshire, they identified 116 recusants and 128 non-communicants, so people who were attending Mass but weren't actually taking communion. So in 1577 they conducted a survey. Now there are some flaws in this, to be fair. This concentrated on known malcontents, so people who are known to be recusants, and on the nobility, and it found that there were 1,500 recusants. Now, the weakness in this is that it occurred a number of years after the papal bull, when the impact of the bull had started to die out, and also it didn't focus on everybody in the country, it only focused on the nobility. There are reasons for this, of course. The nobility are the people who are likely to be able to stage a working revolt, a revolt that actually has impact, so I suppose that's why you would focus on that group of people. There are some details to note. For example, in Lancashire in 1577 there were 45 names on the list of recusants, but in 1578 there were 304. So there is some evidence to say that the number of Catholics refusing to go to church did increase, but then we'll look at some legislation that actually acted to halt that next. Okay, so another positive for Elizabeth and for England is that this bill did allow her to pass some stricter laws from 1571. These laws were added to, they were known as the Acts of Treason, they were added to gradually all over the next 10 years. So some of the things that it now made very clear that it was treason if you did this was to introduce copies of the bull. So if Jesuit priests or missionary priests arrived in England with copies of the bull, they could be arrested under the Acts of Treason. People who left England and didn't return within a year because they were travelling for Catholic reasons were deprived of their property. This was really aimed at the nobility. Affirmation that Elizabeth was a heretic, a schismatic, or not the rightful queen was also now considered to be an act of treason. Now, Elizabeth was very keen that people should not be arrested because of their religious beliefs, that it was not about whether you were Catholic or whether you were Protestant, but it was more about whether or not you were going to accept that she is the rightful Queen of England and therefore going to follow her laws and the laws of the country. There was lots of pressure from the House of Commons, there was lots of pressure from the Puritans, which I'll look at when we talk about the negative impacts of the papal bull. One of the laws that actually was quite tangible for average people in England was the fine for recusancy. This in 1581 was raised to £20, which is quite a significant leap. So there were much stricter laws, and all of these were aimed at treason rather than religious conviction. Now, there were some negatives for the Pope. The Jesuit and missionary priests who had been training and travelling to England for many years were now finding it very difficult to not actually commit treason. These treason laws had tightened up what you could and couldn't say, and when missionary and Jesuit priests were asked direct questions such as, what should we do, should we follow the Queen, where is our allegiance, who are you allied to, I think it made it very difficult for them to give an answer that answered their believers and their followers' questions without actually committing treason. Robert Parsons and Edmund Campion raised this with the Pope in 1580, so actually the bill has made it very difficult for them to carry out their work, because prior to the acts of treason it was a bit of a grey area about what they could and couldn't say, whereas now, because of these acts and because of the determination of the House of Commons to actually make sure that people were being committed for treason, they found themselves in a far more dangerous situation. Okay, so there were some negatives for Elizabeth and some positive impacts for the Pope. One of these is the kind of theory, this change in Catholic theory, which Lotherington talks about. He says that it was a marked change in theory, and this theory change was not lost on Parliament, the Church of England, or Philip himself. And so what he's saying is that it's less about the actual document itself, but it is the idea behind it that the Catholic Church are no longer going to be patient They're no longer going to be very passive and allow Elizabeth to make changes to the church in England, but actually they were going to comment upon that. They were going to say something about it. So even though Pius has made some mistakes, and in both the actual sort of timing of the bull and the technicalities of the bull, the theory behind it is that he's making a stand against what he deems to be the eradication of Catholicism in England, and this theory is more important than the actual document itself. Another negative for Elizabeth is that it makes the threat to England far more tangible. Now, instead of there being this talk of rebellion and talk of plots, actually that's very tangible, to the point where a few months after the bull was released, in 1570, a Spanish armament sailed down the Channel, and there was general thought in England that Philip was now coming to impose the bull. So this threat was far more realistic and far more likely. Now this links with the pressure that Elizabeth receives in the House of Commons. She continues to stand against what she thinks is parliamentary interference, and she refuses to admit that conflict was inevitable. Now, you could argue that the Puritans in the House of Commons and men like William Cecil are jumping on the fact that the papal bull has been released as an opportunity to pass anti-Catholic laws that they had probably been wanting to pass for a long time, and that they use this threat to try and exacerbate how likely conflict is going to be, whereas Elizabeth is now having to sort of fight that battle with them and say that actually conflict is not inevitable, and that she is very, very concerned that by imposing even stricter anti-Catholic laws that she would then encourage revolt. So because of the papal bull, she is now having to negotiate with the Puritans in the House of Commons, who are now very excited about the fact they can pass more laws. She was right in many ways in that if she imposed really strict anti-Catholic laws, it could prompt some people to act far more determinedly than previously. Men like Ridolfi, people like Mary Stuart, the papal bull and the anti-Catholic laws gives them hope that actually if they stage a revolt, if they plot, if they take her from power, that Catholics in England will actually rise up and will join them. And it will make quite a smooth transition between the end of Elizabeth and the new reign of Mary Stuart. It doesn't help that she executes so many priests. She executes 250 priests of very prominent Catholics, 50 more die in prison, so it is a concern that she will inspire further plots. So it was, as Lotherington has said before, it's a mark-changing theory. It's not lost on the main players in this, so the Church of England and Philip. And it's Philip actually says that this sudden and unexpected step will make matters worse and will drive the Queen and her friends to more to oppress and persecute the few good Catholics remaining in England. So I think it is fair to say that the main players are very aware that because of this rash behaviour from the Pope, that it will inspire the House of Commons and Elizabeth to act in a far more determined way. That in turn will then inspire people like Ridolfi and Mary Stuart to act in a far more determined way, and therefore it drags Philip of Spain into this, because he wasn't willing to get into it, but he would have to act if everybody else was acting strongly. Elton says that it is an unmistakable declaration of war, and again, it's a fair point. He says it is threatening to break the bonds between the monarch and her people. So therefore Elizabeth would see every Catholic as a potential traitor. So this easy relationship that Elizabeth has had of compromise in the previous 12 years suddenly makes everybody now a threat to her. So it does up the ante, and I think that this is a real negative for Elizabeth because it's forcing her hand to act. She doesn't want to act in a very anti-Catholic way, but she can't ignore the fact that every Catholic now is potentially a traitor, as Lotherington has said. She also has to act in 1572 when Protestants are attacked in France in St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. She can't separate the papal bulls from 1570 and now this very clear attack on Protestants in 1572. It is very much like a Catholic plot that is an international conspiracy to rid Puritans and Protestants and Presbyterians from Europe. So again, her hand is forced to act, and this is the pattern that continues until 1588, that Elizabeth's hand is forced to act in ways that she doesn't actually want to act, but she has no choice in the matter. So just to conclude with three main historians' opinions, so there are two from Elton. On one hand, he says that the bull fell flat, in that the actual hope that the Pope has of the papal bull, that it would inspire Catholics, that it would then, a revolt would happen, and he would essentially leave England over to the ordinary Catholic, and they would just rid themselves of a queen that they no longer had allegiance to. That didn't work. So Elton has a fair point when he says the bull did fall flat. It didn't serve the purpose that the Pope had wanted it to serve. He does also say that it is an unmistakable declaration of war, and it is. It doesn't work immediately, and even in 1588, when Philip does attempt to invade England, it is not because of the papal bull. It is one piece of the puzzle, but it is not the main reason. And Philip did not send troops to England brandishing copies of the bull. That is not what the 1588 invasion was about. However, it is more of a theoretical war, that the Catholic Church is very, very clearly distancing itself from Elizabeth, and is very clearly saying that we support the Catholics in your country and not you, and that if it comes down to it, we will side with those people and we will not recognise you as a monarch. So I think, again, Elton's quote that it is an unmistakable declaration of war is very useful to you. And Lotherington as well, he talks about the fact that it's a change in theory. He says it's a marked change in theory that wasn't lost on Parliament, the Church of England, nor on Philip. And I think, again, that is a very fair point that Lotherington is making, that it is not the actual tangible impact of the bull that is important, but it is a change in Catholic theory that they are no longer willing to negotiate with or accept Elizabeth as a monarch in England. So I hope you've made some good notes from that. I hope that has covered some of the positive impacts for Elizabeth and some of the positive impacts for Catholics and the Pope of the papal bull. There are other historians who've said quite a lot. Haig obviously has commented quite detailed in a quite a detailed way about the impact of the bull and how it changed religion and legislation in England. And he does give quite a lot of detail, so I would suggest that you read what Haig has to say. When you write your essay, it's really important that you do give both sides and you do give historians interpretations. So please remember to include those in your argument.